My name is Margaret Dawson, and on that July 4th afternoon, as fireworks cracked against the Indiana sky, I walked behind the man who was supposed to be my husband. My coworker clung to his arm and laughed as though I never existed. She called him her husband, and I, his real wife, stood alone with a paper plate of potato salad trembling in my hand. That picnic wasn't just about celebrating America's freedom. It was the day I realized I had to fight for my own. The park smelled of charcoal and sunscreen kids chasing each other between picnic blankets and a brass band playing Stars and Stripes Forever near the gazebo. Families waved tiny flags, neighbors shared coolers full of soda and beer, and everyone seemed wrapped in joy except me. My heart pounded harder than the drums echoing across the field as I watched Daniel lean in close to Linda, the woman I once trained at work, the woman who now whispered into my husband's ear. I tried to keep my composure, smiling at folks who greeted me, though I could feel their eyes drifting toward the little triangle that had formed him, her and me, an unwanted shadow at the edge. I overheard whispers, the kind of hushed tones that cut deeper than shouts. Isn't that his wife over there? But he's with her now, isn't he? Every syllable was another pin pressed into my skin. For a moment, I thought about storming over demanding answers in front of the whole town. But I didn't. Not yet. I sat on a folding chair by the sidelines, clutching my styrofoam cup of lemonade so tightly my knuckles turned white. I watched Linda toss her head back in laughter, her hand brushing Daniel's shoulder, staking her claim right where everyone could see. He didn't pull away. He never even looked in my direction. It struck me then this wasn't a sudden betrayal. It had been building for months, maybe years, right under my nose. Late nights at the office, business trips that didn't require overnight bags, but always seemed to end with him showered and distant. The subtle cologne that wasn't his brand. The way he started calling me Margaret instead of honey, as if intimacy had quietly slipped out the back door. As the sun dipped low and the band struck up God Bless America, I felt an ache deeper than loneliness. It was humiliation. In a town like ours, people notice everything, the kind of car you drive, the church pew you sit in, and especially the cracks in a marriage. To them, I wasn't Margaret, wife and mother. I was the poor woman whose husband had been stolen by her own coworker. I thought back to the life Daniel and I had built, the little brick house with the green shutters, the rose bush I planted our first spring, the 2 children we raised, who were now grown with families of their own. We'd survived recessions, sickness, and the loss of parents. I had believed that counted for something, yet there he was, tossing a frisbee with Linda's nephew, as if he had traded decades of loyalty for a fresh face and a louder laugh. When the first fireworks shot into the sky, children squealed with delight. Couples held hands, families cheered, and I sat there, frozen, my chest tight. Red, white, and blue sparks rained down, lighting Linda's smile as she leaned against Daniel's shoulder. It was a cruel joke, really. Rockets exploding overhead to celebrate freedom, while I felt more trapped than ever. Still, as the grand finale painted the sky with bursts of gold, something shifted inside me. A thought as sharp and sudden as the crack of a firework. This ends tonight. I couldn't control Daniel's choices. I couldn't erase Linda's smirk, but I could control how much longer I let myself be treated as invisible. If freedom meant anything, it meant reclaiming my dignity, my strength, my story. That night, while the smoke of the fireworks still lingered over the park, I walked home alone. Each step was heavy, but steady. My neighbors might gossip, my children might be shocked, and the church ladies might whisper. But none of that mattered as much as the vow I made silently under that smoky July sky. I would no longer be the woman left standing alone. I would find my freedom, and I would make them both regret underestimating me. I went to bed not as a broken wife, but as a woman sharpening her resolve. Tomorrow, the war for my freedom would begin. The morning after that July 4th picnic, the house felt colder than usual, though the summer heat pressed against the windows. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the coffee pot, sputtering on the counter, wondering how something as ordinary as brewing coffee could feel so foreign. The silence in the house was heavy, almost accusing, as if the walls themselves knew what had unfolded the night before. Daniel came in through the back door smelling faintly of cologne I didn't recognize. He didn't offer me a good morning, didn't ask if I'd slept well. Instead, he rummaged through the fridge, muttered about being late for work, and left without so much as a glance in my direction. For years I had filled the silence in our home with small talk, with questions about his day, with laughter about trivial things. But now I simply let him leave the screen door slamming shut behind him, sounding more like a final goodbye than a daily routine. I washed the coffee cup slowly, watching soap bubbles rise and pop, and thought about the years we had built together. Daniel and I had met in the late 1970s, in that very town. I was a teller at the local bank, and he was a young man full of ambition, coming in with plans to start his own business. He had a sparkle in his eye back then, the kind of energy that made people believe in him. I did. We were married within 2 years, building a life that seemed so certain. I left my job to raise our children, believing I was supporting him, supporting us. I took pride in keeping our home warm and cooking meals from scratch, in making sure the Whitmore family name carried respect in the community. Daniel worked long hours, and I told myself it was for the good of the family. But the signs had been there, hadn't they? Late nights at the office explained away with vague excuses. Trips to Indianapolis that somehow never included hotel receipts. The growing distance at home, how he stopped reaching for my hand at church. How he ate dinner quickly and disappeared into his study. Even the way he began to avoid eye contact when I asked simple questions like whether he'd be home for supper. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself, it was the realization that I had ignored the clues. Maybe I wanted so badly to keep our family intact that I chose not to see. Or maybe, like many women of my generation, I believed endurance was the measure of a good wife. You worked through the hard times. You didn't complain. You certainly didn't leave. I thought back to the first Christmas after our wedding. We couldn't afford much, so Daniel made me a wooden jewelry box by hand. I kept it for decades, storing not just jewelry, but letters, keepsakes, memories of a man who seemed devoted. Now I wondered, had that man ever really existed? Or had I built him out of my own hope and faith? The days after the picnic blurred together. I found myself driving past Daniel's office just to see if his car was there. Sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes it was parked beside Linda's little red sedan. I hated myself for stooping to that level, for playing detective in my own life, but the not knowing was worse. The whispers in town grew louder, or maybe I was just more sensitive to them. At the grocery store, I caught sight of 2 women from church looking at me over the cantaloupe bin, their mouths tight with pity. At the post office, a neighbor asked how I was holding up, though I hadn't told her anything. Word travels fast in a small town, and betrayal is a story people can't resist. One evening, I confronted Daniel at the dinner table. I asked him straight out if he was seeing Linda. He didn't deny it. He didn't even flinch. He just sighed, as if I were a burden interrupting his plans, and said, "Margaret, things have changed. You need to accept that. Accept that." 2 words that cut deeper than any shouted accusation. He expected me to accept that the man I had given my life to had chosen someone else. that decades of loyalty, of raising children, of keeping his home, were to be set aside like last season's clothes. I went to bed that night with tears soaking the pillow. But somewhere in those hours of sleeplessness, my sorrow began to harden into something else. If he thought I would crumble, he was mistaken. I didn't know how yet, but I would find a way to reclaim what was mine, my dignity, my life, maybe even a measure of justice. For now, I kept my head down. At church, I smiled through clenched teeth. At the grocery store, I pretended not to notice the stares. I held myself together for the sake of appearances, but inside, a storm was brewing. Every time Daniel came home late, every time I saw Linda's smirk in the office hallway, every time someone whispered behind my back, it was fuel for the fire I didn't yet know how to release. I wasn't ready to fight, not yet, but I was no longer blind. The weeks that followed felt like walking through a play where everyone else knew their lines, except me. I went about my errands, church on Sunday, groceries on Tuesday, volunteer work at the library while whispers trailed me like shadows. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. The whole town knew Daniel had chosen Linda, and they watched me carefully, wondering whether I'd break. I first noticed it at church. Mrs. Peterson, who usually sat beside me in the pew, slid down a seat to give me space as though betrayal might be contagious. After the service, I overheard two younger women from choir whispering near the coffee urn. "She must feel so embarrassed," one said. "Imagine being replaced by your own coworker." I wanted to shout at them. Tell them it wasn't embarrassment I felt, but anger. A deep, bone-cutting anger that kept me awake at night. But I stayed silent, carrying my Bible against my chest like armor. It wasn't just church. At the grocery store, I found Linda standing beside Daniel in the checkout line, her hand resting lightly on his arm as she chatted with the cashier. She turned her head just enough to meet my eyes, then smiled smug, victorious, as if daring me to react. I forced myself to keep moving, placing bread and milk on the conveyor belt. But inside, I burned. The woman I once mentored, who asked me how to balance work and family, now flaunted herself as the new Mrs. Whitmore. One Saturday afternoon, our neighborhood hosted its annual block barbecue. I nearly stayed home, but I knew if I skipped it, the gossip would only grow. So I dressed carefully, putting on a navy blouse and pearls, determined to look strong, even if I felt anything but. When I arrived, laughter rang out from the cul-de-sac, smoke rising from grills, children chasing each other with sparklers left over from Independence Day. I spotted Daniel near the buffet table. Linda stood beside him, wearing the gold bracelet I had received from him on our 25th anniversary. My stomach twisted. That bracelet wasn't just jewelry, it was a memory, a symbol of years of devotion. And there it was, dangling from her wrist like a prize. Neighbors tried to act casual, greeting me with polite smiles, but I saw the glances, the nudges, the way conversations hushed when I walked by. Daniel didn't come over. He didn't even wave. Instead, he filled Linda's plate, laughing as though she'd been part of our community all along. I found a seat on the edge of the gathering, listening to the chatter around me without really hearing it. All I could focus on was the scene across the lawn. Linda leaning close to Daniel, her laugh louder than necessary, her body angled just enough to remind everyone present that she had won. In that moment, I felt invisible, erased from my own life. The years I spent raising children, cooking meals, keeping our home together, they meant nothing to him now. It was as though I had been written out of the story, my role finished, my presence irrelevant. I excused myself early, claiming a headache, and walked home under the fading summer light. My shoes clicked against the pavement, echoing my humiliation with every step. Inside the quiet of my home, I collapsed onto the couch and let the tears come. They were hot, bitter, unstoppable. But beneath them, something else stirred a realization that humiliation, once it burned long enough, hardened into resolve. The next morning, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection. Puffy eyes, graying hair, pulled back lines etched deep from years of sacrifice. For the first time, I asked myself a hard question. Who am I if I'm no longer his wife? The answer didn't come easily. Decades of my identity had been wrapped up in being Mrs. Daniel Whitmore, hostess of Sunday dinners, keeper of family traditions, supporter of his dreams. But now, stripped of that role, I felt a strange kind of freedom. Painful, yes, but also liberating. If he had erased me, perhaps it was time I began rewriting myself. Still, I wasn't ready to announce my intentions. To the town, I remained the quiet, humiliated wife. To Daniel and Linda, I was a non-threat, a woman too beaten down to fight back. But inside, I began to plan. I didn't know what shape my revenge would take or how I would gather the strength, but I knew one thing: I would not let them erase me. Every whispered conversation, every smug glance, every laugh shared at my expense, it all became fuel. I carried it quietly, storing it away like dry wood, waiting for a spark. And though the whole town saw me as invisible, I knew something they didn't. The most dangerous fire is the one that smolders unseen. The night Daniel moved out was quieter than I expected. No shouting. No slammed doors, no pleading from me. He simply packed a suitcase, grabbed a few shirts from the closet, and left. The sound of his car backing down the driveway echoed through the empty house, leaving behind a silence so thick it seemed to press on my chest. At first, I thought the loneliness would be the hardest part, but it wasn't. The hardest part was the weight of bills stacking on the counter, reminders of how little control I had over the life I thought was secure. The mortgage, utilities, insurance responsibilities we once shared were suddenly mine alone. I sat at the kitchen table with a checkbook and calculator, realizing for the first time how completely I had trusted him with the finances. I started selling things. The second car went first, then the antique dining set his mother had passed down. I held a garage sale one humid Saturday, watching strangers carry away pieces of my life for a few crumpled bills. Neighbors stopped by offering sympathetic smiles, but their pity only deepened my shame. I clipped coupons, stretched leftovers, and kept the thermostat lower than comfort allowed. At night, I lay in bed counting pennies instead of sheep, wondering how I had gone from a respected wife in a brick house with roses out front to a woman scraping by alone. Our children, now grown, tried to help. My daughter Susan called often, offering to cover groceries or take me out for dinner. My son Michael offered to fix the leaky faucet and mow the lawn. But I hated leaning on them. I had always been the caretaker, the one who held the family together. Accepting their help felt like admitting defeat. The cruelest blow came one Sunday afternoon when Daniel brought Linda to meet Susan. I hadn't been invited, of course. Susan called me later, her voice trembling with anger. He introduced her like she's part of our family now, Mom. Like she belongs. I sat there, phone pressed to my ear, heart pounding. My daughter's outrage mirrored my own humiliation. I thought I'd cried every tear I had left, but that night proved me wrong. Alone in the quiet house, I sobbed until my pillow was soaked, my chest aching with the kind of grief that feels bottomless. Yet somewhere in that ocean of sorrow, a new current began to stir. I started journaling. Each night after the day's struggles, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and wrote everything I couldn't say aloud. Anger, heartbreak, memories of happier times, even small triumphs, like paying a bill on time or fixing a broken hinge. Slowly, the pages became a map of my survival. I also found comfort in my faith. I returned to the little church down the street, slipping into the back pew, not to avoid gossip, but to find quiet strength. I prayed not for Daniel to return, but for the courage to face whatever came next. One evening, while rummaging through boxes in the attic, I came across a stack of old photographs. There we were, young and hopeful. Daniel's arm around me at the county fair, the two of us smiling in front of the house when it was first built, the children blowing out birthday candles. I expected the pictures to break me. Instead, they filled me with something else perspective. Life had seasons. This was just one of them, painful, yes, but not permanent. Still, anger simmered beneath the surface. Every memory of him with Linda, every time someone in town looked at me with pity, added fuel to the fire. I realized betrayal hadn't destroyed me. It had stripped me down to something raw, something unrecognizable. And from that rawness, something new could emerge. One night, after balancing another stack of bills, I whispered to myself, "You will not be erased." Saying it out loud gave me chills. It was the first time I felt power in my own voice again. Daniel thought he had broken me. Linda thought she had replaced me. The town thought I was finished. But they were all wrong. Betrayal may have broken my heart, but it was about to awaken my spirit. One late August afternoon, I decided to tackle the clutter Daniel had left behind. The attic was hot and stuffy dust motes dancing in the sunlight that filtered through a cracked window. I pulled open cardboard boxes filled with tax returns receipts and old business files. My plan was simple: sort, shred, and move on. But life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. At the bottom of one box, beneath a stack of faded bank statements, I found a thin folder labeled with handwriting I didn't recognize. My stomach tightened as I opened it. Inside were copies of documents, property deeds, investment accounts, and withdrawals I'd never heard of. Some of them were in Daniel's name, others in Linda's. I sat on the attic floor, fanning through the pages, my hands trembling. Over and over, I saw the same pattern: money transferred quietly, assets, hidden accounts tucked away under different variations of names. I wasn't an expert in finance, but even I could see what it meant. Daniel had been funneling money for years, moving it where I couldn't reach, and now weaving Linda into the fabric of it all. Anger flared first, but then a strange calm settled over me. For the first time since the July 4th picnic, I didn't feel powerless. I felt equipped. These papers weren't just scraps of evidence. They were leverage. I placed the folder carefully in a tote bag and carried it downstairs, my heart pounding. That evening, I called an old friend from church, Henry Collins, a retired lawyer, known for his sharp mind and quiet loyalty. I invited him over, under the pretense of sharing a pot of coffee. When Henry sat across from me at the kitchen table, I spread out the documents. His eyes scanned them slowly, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. Finally, he looked up and said, "Margaret, this isn't just unfaithfulness. This is fraud. He's hiding assets. And if he's doing it the way I think he could be, in serious legal trouble." I leaned back, my heart racing. For months, I had been the humiliated wife, the woman everyone pitied. Now, in my hands, I held the keys to something far more powerful than gossip or sympathy: truth. Henry advised me to keep quiet, to gather everything I could before Daniel caught wind of what I knew. "Don't confront him yet," he warned. "If you tip him off, he'll bury the rest, and you'll lose your chance." So I played the part. At church, I kept my smile polite. At the grocery store, I endured Linda's smug smirks. At night, I carefully copied and organized every document, labeling envelopes, building a case brick by brick. I told no one, not even my children. The fewer people who knew, the safer my leverage would be. The secrecy gave me a strange thrill. For the first time in months, I wasn't reacting to betrayal, I was directing the course of it. Each time I added a new piece of evidence to my growing pile, I felt stronger, steadier, more certain that justice was possible. One evening, while reviewing bank records, I stumbled on an account in Linda's name that Daniel had been funneling money into for nearly a year. I pictured the two of them laughing at my expense, confident I'd been left with nothing. The thought didn't break me this time. It fueled me. I began journaling less about my grief and more about my strategy. I mapped out steps, listed questions for Henry, even rehearsed in my mind how the confrontation might unfold. The Margaret who wept into her pillow was still there, but she was joined now by a new version, one who was careful, calculating, and no longer afraid. The turning point came when I found a letter tucked inside one of the files. It was from Daniel to Linda, written in his handwriting, speaking of a future where everything would be in our hands soon. My throat tightened as I read it. Not because of the romance, his words were hollow, almost businesslike, but because of the arrogance. He truly believed he could erase me, transfer away our life's work, and walk free into a future built on lies. Not if I had anything to say about it. That night, as I filed the letter alongside the other documents, I whispered a prayer, not for reconciliation, not for revenge in its cruelest form, but for justice. Justice for the years I had given, for the family I had raised, for the dignity I refused to surrender. From that moment forward, I stopped feeling like the victim. I wasn't waiting for life to crush me anymore. I was preparing piece by piece for the day Daniel and Linda would face the truth they thought they could bury. The day we walked into the courthouse, the air felt thick, almost electric, like the moments before a summer storm. I wore a navy dress and the same string of pearls I'd worn to our children's graduations. It wasn't vanity, it was armor. Daniel and Linda walked in ahead of me, hand in hand, their confidence written all over their faces. She wore a bright red blazer, as though she were the star of some show, and he looked smug, like a man certain of victory. I kept my head high, but inside, my heart pounded. Months of humiliation, grief, and quiet preparation had led to this. Henry, my retired lawyer friend, had introduced me to a younger attorney who specialized in divorce and financial fraud. We had met in secret, reviewed every document, and built a case so solid that even Daniel's charm couldn't bend it. The courtroom itself was small, wood-paneled walls, a state flag hanging behind the judge's bench, rows of benches filled with townsfolk who had come not out of duty, but out of curiosity. In small towns, trials are theater, and today I was unwillingly cast as one of the leads. When the judge entered the room, hushed, papers shuffled, feet scuffed the floor, and then silence. The proceedings began. Daniel's lawyer painted him as a hard-working man, misunderstood by a bitter wife. He spoke of irreconcilable differences and a new chapter in life, glossing over decades of deceit. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, waiting. Then my attorney rose. Calmly, she began presenting the evidence I had collected. First came the financial records accounts. Daniel had hidden assets transferred into Linda's name. Then came the property deeds, the tax evasion trail, the fraudulent signatures. Each document landed like a hammer blow, cracking the facade Daniel had built. I watched his face shift from confidence to discomfort, then to something closer to panic. Linda fidgeted beside him, her bravado dimming as the weight of the evidence grew. The spectators whispered their curiosity, turning into shock. And then the letter. The one Daniel had written to Linda, promising a future where everything would be in our hands soon. My attorney read it aloud, her voice steady, every word echoing in the courtroom. I saw neighbors lean forward, their eyes widening. It was no longer my accusation against his word. It was his own handwriting condemning him. Daniel tried to speak, tried to explain, but the judge silenced him. The law didn't bend for charm, not when the truth was laid bare. Hours passed, but time felt suspended. Finally, the judge delivered the ruling. Daniel was guilty of concealing assets and ordered to repay what he had siphoned away. Linda, complicit in the scheme, was named in the judgment. And me, I was granted my rightful share, enough to rebuild without fear of losing my home or dignity. The gavel struck final and sharp. Just like that, the man who had humiliated me in public, who thought he could erase me, had been stripped of the very reputation he valued most. As we filed out of the courtroom, I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. The once proud Daniel Dawson now looked small. Shoulders, slumped eyes downcast. Linda clutched her purse. Tight, her face pale, her smile gone. The town that once pitied me now saw the truth. Betrayal wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of my strength. Outside, the summer sun was blinding the courthouse steps, hot underfoot. I paused for a moment, breathing deeply, the weight of months of secrecy and sorrow lifting. Neighbors nodded at me with respect instead of pity. My children hugged me tightly, tears of relief in their eyes. I walked down those steps not as the woman abandoned, but as the woman who had stood her ground. For the first time in decades, I wasn't carrying the burden of someone else's choices. I was free. The weeks after the court ruling felt like waking up in a new life. The house was the same green shutters, same rosebush out front, but something inside me had shifted. For the first time in years, I could walk into my kitchen without feeling dread. The stack of bills that once haunted me was smaller, now manageable. I no longer felt like a woman drowning. I felt like a woman resurfacing. At first, the quiet was strange. For decades, I'd lived with Daniel's voice filling every corner, sometimes booming, sometimes dismissive, sometimes sweet, when he needed something. Now the silence belonged to me, and I began to enjoy it. I filled it with my own choices, music on the radio, a kettle whistling the sound of my pen scratching in my journal. I started small. I enrolled in a computer class at the local community college. At 62, I was the oldest student in the room, but I didn't mind. Learning gave me energy I hadn't felt in years. I bought a second-hand laptop, practicing typing until my fingers found their rhythm again. From there, I picked up bookkeeping jobs for small businesses and town work that reminded me I was capable, independent, and valuable. Money wasn't flowing, but it was enough. And the best part was it was mine. Every dollar I earned carried the weight of dignity that no courtroom ruling could provide. Socially, too, I began to blossom. I joined a local book club, something I'd always wanted but never made time for. The women welcomed me warmly, and we laughed over novels, drank coffee, and shared pieces of our lives. For once, I wasn't defined as Daniel's wife or the poor woman left behind. I was simply Margaret Reader, thinker, friend. My children noticed the change. Susan often told me, "Mom, you sound lighter these days." Michael hugged me tighter whenever he visited, telling me how proud he was. Their approval mattered, but more than that, I was proud of myself. Of course, whispers about Daniel and Linda still floated through town. They had retreated from the spotlight, embarrassed after the courtroom spectacle. Occasionally, I'd see them at the grocery store. Linda no longer smirked. She avoided my eyes. Daniel sometimes looked like he wanted to speak, but I kept walking. I owed him nothing, not a word, not a glance, not an ounce of my peace. As autumn rolled in the leaves turning gold and red, I found myself reflecting more deeply. Revenge had fueled me, yes. Justice had given me relief. But what sustained me was something bigger, the decision to live again fully and freely, without letting bitterness take root. One evening, I sat on the porch swing, the cool air brushing my face. The neighborhood kids rode bikes up and down the street, their laughter echoing into the fading light. I realized then that life was never about avoiding pain. It was about choosing how to rise after it knocks you down. I thought of other women neighbors, friends, women in my church, who might one day face their own betrayals. I wanted them to know what I had learned, that no matter your age, no matter how deep the wound, you can begin again. So here is my truth for whoever needs to hear it. Freedom isn't always won in fireworks or courtrooms. Sometimes it begins in the quiet moment when you decide you are worth more than the pain you've endured. Sometimes it starts with a single step away from what broke you and toward what makes you whole. If you've ever been betrayed, if you've ever felt erased, know this: you are not powerless. You are not finished. You are still here, and your story is still yours to write. As for me, my Independence Day didn't end on July 4th. It began that night, and it carries on in every choice I make to stand tall, to live fully, and to embrace the life I almost lost. And to you, listening to my story, if it touched, you share it with someone who might need hope. If you want to walk alongside me through more journeys like this, I invite you to subscribe. Together we can remind one another that betrayal isn't the end it can be, the spark of a new beginning. The end.